Particularly pleased that we have with us Ms. Valerie from the Governor's Office. She is the Senior Policy Advisor, and one of the areas that she advises the Governor on is energy policy. Valerie will speak, and then we'll give you a chance to ask a few questions. So let's welcome her.
So it's good to be with y'all. I know that what you're probably interested in is not what I'm going to say, what the Governor's going to say tonight, so I can give you a little bit of a preview on that. As you know, energy is actually one of the biggest challenges Michigan faces in terms of looking at its future in both kind of what we have to do to deal with all the different federal mandates coming down and an older fleet, but also in making the decisions that we'll be living with for a long time to come. To give you something of an illustration, in Michigan, in the next 2 years, we're going to see 11 coal plants close, almost for sure. Nine are definitely have already been slated, possibly 2 more. This really matters because of what we've seen in the Upper Peninsula, for what this does to the grid. So in the Upper Peninsula, there's one major source of generation. There's some small dams and a few other small units and biomass, but what really powers the Upper Peninsula is a very large coal plant in the Marquette area. It's an older coal plant. It's been flooded out. It has some newer technologies, but it would be pretty much impossible for it to economically meet some of the new regulations that will be hitting right around 2020. So the company that owns it had announced that it planned to retire it, but that there was no sort of replacement generation proposed. Now, what that meant for the citizens of the Upper Peninsula was twofold. First, that the question was, if they want to retire it, but they can't because the grid will collapse, meaning everybody in the entire Upper Peninsula can't get power. So somebody's got to pay for that, and the federal government, in its wisdom, decided that that would essentially be the people of the UP, and so they were on the hook for approximately $100 million a year on top of their current rates to do that. It depended on where you lived and how much you used, how much of that share it was, but let's all understand we've got 300,000 people responsible for $100 million payment. No matter where you live, it's going to hit you somewhat. And then the question was, so keep it running in the meantime, and then what? And the only thing that the federal government can actually mandate is that you build very large transmission lines, which in the Upper Peninsula would have cost at least $500 million to replace instead of having a power plant, what it would take. So with that total gift from the federal government of a really unsustainable and immediate rate hike in one sense, in response directly to federal mandates, and with no real solution coming from them except that they could then mandate $500 million, costs a lot less than that to build a plant, by the way, baseload plant, which is what we needed.
Sorry, how many megawatts are you talking?
So the Prescott plant is 437, is its nameplate capacity. And so the question was, what do you do? Now, the Upper Peninsula is probably the simplest place in Michigan to solve that kind of problem through private agreements. By simplest, I mean almost impossible, but not impossible. And that's because 80% of the energy demand for that utilities Michigan business and about half the energy demand for the Upper Peninsula as a whole comes from a single customer, Cliffs Natural Resources, which is the iron ore mine up there. So it's the kind of thing where if you got one customer who can deal with one company to build something, and you can get everybody in the room and figure out what to do in the meantime, you can actually solve that through private arrangements, which was just announced last week. We do have term sheets signed to have a company take over that plant and run it for 4 years without charging everybody $100 million extra for doing it. In part, that's possible because Cliffs Natural Resources is coming back to purchase power from that plant. They had left under the choice law. They had a special exemption to allow them to do so. So they're coming back, so the plant can be supported. And then the plant can come down in 2020 and new natural gas generation can be built on site that also can supply steam to the mines. And so all of these, through many multi-party agreements, have been announced. It took an awful lot of work by an awful lot of people. But that's what the folks in the Upper Peninsula faced in terms of trying to replace that baseload generation. Now, if it were just an Upper Peninsula problem, we'd be here to say, hey, great, it's solved, now we're moving on. The problem that we have is we're really seeing it potentially crop up in the Lower Peninsula. And what's going on there is that, like I mentioned, we have all those coal plants that are slated to come down. Most of those are in the lower. That means we're actually looking at a fairly significant shortfall in terms of having enough power to meet both the daily needs plus that safety margin so that our grid doesn't crash like it did in 2003 for those who were in the Lower Peninsula in 2003. Basically, you had to drive to Kalamazoo to get to a part of the grid that worked. And it had gone down in Ohio, Michigan. It was a multi-state thing. So what they're telling us is that we will no longer be able to meet the safety margin that prevents that from happening come 2016 without some pretty drastic changes because of the number of coal plants that are slated to retire. So, for instance, one of our utilities, Consumers Energy, had announced the retirement of its 7, they call them the Classic 7. They're all plants that would more than qualify for AARP membership. I mean, they are older coal plants. That it planned to retire them. The EPA then kind of triply upped that through a court order that was a consent agreement, but a court mandated one that they would take down those plants. But before they can do that, they have to ask the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission for permission, because those folks are the folks that make sure the grid doesn't collapse. And even though they've kind of, whenever there's a court order, sort of rubber stamped usually the closure of plants, in this case, right after the UP order came down on the same day, in which they basically told Michigan we'd be paying an awful lot of money to keep that plant running unless we came up with any solution. They also then came in and said, we're not so sure Consumers Energy can retire those plants. We have to get a lot more information because it might really affect everybody else. Now, in my mind, it's really not helpful to hear both that, you know, hey, you're under court order to shut those plants down, but you might not be able to do it because we might order you to keep them up. Like, okay. This is where I think the federal government should actually have an energy policy so you don't get directly conflicting instructions from them, but clearly that's not the situation we're in. So what we're facing in Michigan is the same kind of situation that the Upper Peninsula, you know, is facing, and these deals that were announced last week hopefully will avert, but without sort of a, hey, we'll put one company in a room with somebody to own the plant, somebody else will build one, we're all good. You know, in the Lower Peninsula, it's not like there's one person who's 80% of the load that you just sit down and work it out with, right? So in that sense, when I'm looking at what is going to be really important for Michigan in 2016, it's what we do about that base load. And so when you're thinking about how do we make sure that the federal government isn't making our energy policy for us, especially having been given a preview of what a fantastic policy that would be from a UP perspective, the answer has to be that we have to make sure Michigan's energy decisions get made in Michigan. And we have to actually have a plan that looks at capacity as a long-term issue, and takes into account federal regulations that may be coming down, that takes into account Michigan's natural reliability, you know, the good parts, the bad parts, make sure that what we're doing makes sense there, and also that affordability component. Because as many of you may know, Michigan does have higher electricity rates than many of our neighbors in this region. Part of that is, you know, due to being a peninsula. And part of that is due to the fact that we have not in the past had really good holistic decision making when it came time to decide what to do about certain regulations. What would typically happen is, you know, the EPA doesn't regulate things holistically. They do it, okay, now you got to reduce this, now you got to reduce that, and they never kind of all pull it together by like, here's actually what you need to do to get this equipment that would take care of multiple problems, right? That's not how they do it. They do it, you know, this little chunk by that little chunk. So they'd say, okay, you gotta comply with this on, I'll make up, you know, this on ozone. And so what would happen is the utility companies would go to the DEQ and they would say, so we install this thing, right? And DEQ would say, if you install that thing, we think it will meet it, check mark. But DEQ doesn't like have any authority to say, or you could try this, it might be cheaper, or you could do that, it might, you know, they don't really have that ability. So then, you know, the utility company would have their check mark. Okay, I build this, I'm good. They would then take it to the MPSC and they would say, under law, I have to do X. This has a check mark under it as doing X. And the MPSC would say, then check mark, you may spend for X and recover it, right? But there was never a chance for those two agencies to say, whoa, is that plant going to be able to meet the next thing coming down the road, before we make this investment? By the way, what is the next thing coming down the road? By the way, what does that do to reliability? If it doesn't meet it, we do have to take it down, maybe we should start planning now for replacement. Like, there was never that ability, because all DEQ is given under the federal laws to do is give a check mark. Yes, that does it, or no, it doesn't. And when you get to yes, that's all you have to do. And the MPSC was never given the opportunity to say, well, is there another way to meet it, and kind of have that conversation, or say, oh wow, that actually could create some real reliability problems for us, we'd like to kind of talk that through with you. There wasn't like an obvious way for the two agencies to actually talk and plan and make sure that you've got those reliability and affordability checks kind of built into the system. And so it's clear that if we do nothing and we just sort of continue down this path, we're really just leaving ourselves open for the federal government setting our energy policy for us, ordering really expensive builds, whether or not they make sense. Some cases they may, some cases they may not, but that's not really what their process is set up to determine. And they'll certainly sock it to you in the meantime, is what the position of the Upper Peninsula is. So what we need in place is the ability to do that really good decision making and actually take into account all those aspects of energy, that affordability, that reliability, and that protection of the environment as one, and really think about where we need generation and how we get it there. Instead of kind of making these one-off little limited decisions, actually being able to have those kinds of conversations where all those things are taken into account at once, which is obviously not the way that we've done it in the past, or frankly that the federal government does it today, or appears to want to do it in the future. So that's something that is going to be very high on our priority list, because that capacity crunch is coming in 2016. We're going to be short about 1 gigawatt, which is a lot. I know that you folks probably know that because you thought about this, but and this is Lower Peninsula only. It's a big, big amount, and we need to be able to make sure that we're ready to solve it so that the feds don't solve it for us. So that's a really high priority. And as part of this, as you know, the governor has said that he wants to move away from coal. Most of our coal fleet is very old, into natural gas plus more renewables. Now, that is driven by a need to diversify our portfolio when you're getting more than half of your power from any one source, and then that source gets hit with something. You see it in the rates, and we have seen it in the rates in Michigan. But we also have a lot of strengths in natural gas that we didn't have in coal relative to other states. And that's because in Michigan, we have a really strong natural gas infrastructure compared to most other states. Because we have so many homes that use natural gas for heating instead of electricity, as some states have a very high reliance on that, especially in the South, or even propane, we have a lot more people who use natural gas. Also, we have the best storage in the country. Our geology is really, really good for putting natural gas in the ground and being able to get it back out again. We actually invented that here in Michigan. And so we have always had that. That means that between the demand, we also have a natural gas in our ground to be developed. So we've been a place that you could develop it, a place that you could store it, and a place that uses it. So it does not surprise you to know that we also have a lot of pipelines that transport it compared to other places. Now, this isn't to say that we don't need any more natural gas infrastructure depending on what happens in the world, but just that compared to coal, where we have like none, and many of our competitor states with lower rates have coal mines next to coal plants, which couldn't beat for cost, and we just didn't have that option here in Michigan. We're much better positioned if everybody's moving to natural gas in a competitive sense than we were in the coal economy that we were previously. So that is something, and natural gas does have certain advantages over coal in terms of how fast it can be turned on and off. Basically, if you're thinking about baseload plants, nuclear, once it's on, you basically never turn it off until you have to, because it's really hard to kind of get a nuclear plant turned off. And then next comes like coal, which can take a couple days in some cases, to turn on and off. And then kind of biomass and coal are semi-similar in that, depending on how the biomass is designed. And then you have natural gas, which is the fastest on-off of any of the baseload. And by baseload, I mean the stuff that runs all the time. You guys probably know that, because Anyway, that's sort of the suite. So to move to something that has better on and off capability has some real advantages for reliability, especially given more resources that are intermittent on the grid. So that is where Governor Snyder really looks at being as trying to develop a decision-making process that takes into account not just whatever little rule is today's hot topic or whatever capacity problem that we're facing kind of this minute, but actually sets up a system that solves that, taking into account things like reliability and affordability alongside that environmental protection, being able to look at that and remain as adaptable as possible. So in general, thinking about not, one goal, assuming one future, and no matter what we'll do that, but really trying to make sure that our decision-making process drives us to the best decision at any time and takes the power out of Washington, D.C.'s hands and put it back in Michiganders' hands where we think far better solutions will be developed. So the governor is going to be talking some about energy tonight. As some of you may know, he does not speak from a prepared text, so I have no idea the exact amount of time he will spend or exactly what he will say. But you will be hearing a lot of these themes. He will be giving a special message on energy, a second one, this spring, because we're facing such a key time for Michigan, and we're really one of the key places in the country. When you look at how much we're short versus how much other places in the country are short, we're really short. Other places have problems. Cleveland has problems, but in terms of the word gigawatt short, Michigan is really almost ground zero for how short we will be. And part of that is that our fleet was pretty old. But another part of that is just that we have not had the kind of planning for capacity I think that we needed, and the ability to really look at it and say, when you need base load, how are you going to get there? And we've already seen in the Upper Peninsula what it's like if you don't have a plan and the federal government decides it's its job to write it for you. So our goal will be to make sure that Michigan has that plan and that plan gets written by Michiganders who will be living with the results of the decisions for decades to come. So that's where the governor is in terms of priorities, and I look forward to working with as many of you as possible in terms of how we think about structuring Michigan's system to correctly kind of look at all of the different variables one has when trying to make decisions in a changing world. But that is essentially where we are, and I'm happy to